Chapter 8, War of the Flea by Robert Tabor. General Grievous on Guerrilla War in Cyprus. The Political Uses of Terrorism. Errors of British Strategy. Little under 20 pages. Probably try and wrap this up in just under an hour or so. Starting with a quote here. The British, who arm their commandos with knives and instruct them to kill, from the rear, protested vigorously when such tactics were applied to themselves. It may be argued that these things are only permissible in war. This is nonsense. I was fighting a war in Cyprus against the British, and if they did not recognize the fact from the start, they were forced to at the end. The truth is that our form of war, in which a few hundred fell in 4 years, was more selective than most, and I speak as one who has seen battlefields covered with dead. We did not strike, like the bomber, at random. We shot only British servicemen who would have killed us if they could have fired first, and civilians who were traitors or intelligence agents. To shoot down your enemies in the street may be unprecedented, but I was looking for results, not precedents. How did Napoleon win his victories? He took his opponents in the flank or rear, and what is right on the grand scale is not wrong when the scale is reduced and the odds against you are 100 to 1. End quote. With a footnote. The Memoirs of General Grievous, Frederick A. Prager, Incorporated. The words are from Memoirs of the EOKA, footnote here, EOKA Ethniki Organosis Kyprion, Kyprion, Afghanistan, National Organization of Cypriot Fighters. General Grievous is now Commander-in-Chief of the Republic of Cyprus's National Guard. The words are from Memoirs of the EOKA leader, General George Grievous, the subject, terror. Although Grievous is the archetype of the conservative military man, a jingo and a fascist in the eyes of the Greek communists, his philosophy of terrorism approaches that of the anarchists. The state exercises authority by the use of threat of force, argue the anarchists. The policeman on the corner is the agent as well as the symbol of it, and the revolver at his side is there to intimidate or, in the extremity, to kill those who resist him. If then his authority is illicit, being exercised without the just consent of the governed, is it no right and natural to oppose force with force, to kill policemen as one would kill bandits, and to combat usurpers as one would combat an invasion? In effect, this was the reasoning that led Grievous, a Greek Cypriot, to declare war on the British rulers of Greek and Turkish Cyprus. In his memoirs, he writes that it was, quote, with deep regret, but with a high sense of duty, end quote, that he took up arms in 1955 against an old friend and ally, Britain. He blames, not the British people, but a band of politicians, Jews, who denied even the hope of freedom to Cyprus, and he adds, it is on their heads that the guilt rests for the death of so many men, women, and children in the tragic years that followed. The beginning of the Cypriot struggle for independence was announced March 31st, 1955, by a series of explosions across the island. Saboteurs raiding the government radio station in Nicosia set off bombs that wrecked the broadcasting equipment and lifted the roof from the building, causing damage estimated at 60,000 euros. Bombs were thrown into government office buildings and into wireless installations at the Wolseley Barracks, Wolseley, headquarters of a British military force which at that time numbered only 4,000 men. In the port of Limassol, Limassol, a power plant and the two main police stations were bombed. At Larnaca, Larnaca, the police headquarters, the courts, and the British Commissioner's office all were shattered by bomb blasts. The first casualty of the campaign occurred in Famagusta. A member of an EOKA group was electrocuted when he threw a damn rope over a high-tension power line in an attempt to sabotage the electrical supply. Oh, I said damn rope. Damp rope over a high-tension... Goodness gracious. The attack took the world by surprise. Colonial officials were stunned and panic-stricken, says Grievous. The wave of bombing attacks was coupled with more general political action. Young students and school children were rapidly recruited into the independent movement. I intended to turn the youth of Cyprus into the seedbed of EOKA, writes Grievous, and a series of successful demonstrations was organized, sufficiently violent to drive police from the streets and to require the use of soldiers to restore order. Children as young as 10 years old were used to distribute EOKA leaflets and to act as couriers. Teachers who interfered in disregard of the organization's warning were punished severely. A phrase that, as Grievous employed it, usually meant shooting by EOKA execution squads. Pressure was put on Cypriot newspapers that were slow to take the right tone with regard to the campaign. For example, newspapers that failed to denounce the passage of repressive laws. Those of weak spirit soon felt the weight of the EOKA boycott. The wave of terrorism had been initiated by an extremely small group of men, not more than 80, according to Grievous, organized into sabotage squads, or 5 or 6 in all of the principal cities and towns of the island. There were as yet no guerrilla units, although Grievous has personally reconnoitered their island, making notes of favorable places for ambushes, terrain suitable to provide bases for guerrilla action, and so on. The excellent network of roads across the island militated against an extensive guerrilla campaign, and most of those who were to fight as guerrillas were not sent into the countryside until they had outlived their usefulness in the towns, by becoming too well known to risk being seen in the streets. The mountains of the Kyrenia, Kyrenia, range in the heavily wooded Trudeau's range in the southwest were, however, subsequently used as bases of guerrilla operations and for the training of sabotage teams. After the first outbreak of bombings, there was a lull in the terror campaign, broken for some weeks only by isolated attacks against what Grievous calls targets of opportunity. One of these, according to the memoirs, was Robert Armitage, the British governor of Cyprus. As part of Empire Day celebrations in Nicosia, the governor attended a film premiere at the Palace Cinema. He sat throughout the showing for 2 hours, only a few feet from a seat under which a time pencil attached to a Coca-Cola bottle filled with explosive slowly burned. The picture ended. The governor and his party left the theater. 5 minutes later, the bomb exploded, shattering 7 rows of vacant seats and riddling the ceiling with shrapnel. Grievous spent the time between attacks traveling about Nicosia and on occasion into the Kyrenia Mountains, giving orders to group leaders, supervising training, preparing propaganda releases, and generally bolstering morale by his appearances. His identity as Digenis, the leader, Dighenis, the way in which he invariably signed his communiques, had already been revealed. The small Cypriot community party had denounced EOKA as hooligans and pop gun wielders. The party line recalls that taken in Cuba, where the communists denounced Fidel Castro and his supporters as bourgeois putschists. Taking the same cue, the leader of the Greek Communist Party disclosed in a broadcast from Moscow that Digenis was Grievous, while well known to the communists as the leader of the Greek underground organization of World War II called XHI, and later as a commander of Greek army operations against the communist guerrillas of ELAS in the Greek Civil War. Quote, "Comically, the British did not take this piece of information seriously," recalls Grievous. "The idea of an elderly retired officer as the leader of EOKA was too strange for them to accept." Digenis continued to move about freely, in the thin disguise of dark glasses and a clipped mustache. For a time he established a headquarters in the mountains, but later, he relates, he hid in a house in Limassol for 2 years without being discovered or betrayed. EOKA's second wave of attacks came in June. The first victim of the campaign was a policeman killed when a bomb blew a hole in the wall of the divisional police headquarters in Nicosia. 16 men were wounded. A sergeant was killed when an assault group attacked the Amiandos police station, and several other stations were attacked. Grievous had personally selected a target. The commander-in-chief of British land forces in the Middle East, General Keatley, who was accustomed to drive daily into the capital from his home in the Kyrenia coast. "I found a good place for an ambush on the pass over the Kyrenia mountains," writes Grievous, but Archbishop Makarios vetoed the plan and the idea was abandoned. The memoirs reveal that Makarios vetoed a good many plans proposed by the leader and often dragged his feet when Grievous would have forged boldly ahead. The Archbishop held the purse strings. Without funds, Grievous was unable to proceed and was forced to reconsider some of his more drastic schemes, as, for example, when he wished to send execution squads to London to assassinate known Cypriot informers living in Britain on the rewards of their betrayals. In general, however, the campaign proceeded as Grievous wished it to. with the leader maintaining a rigid discipline over his scattered troops of terrorists and saboteurs. I issued frequent warnings that I alone would give orders. Disobedience would be punished by death. Although Grievous says that at the onset he would have been able, given 500 armed men, to drive the British into the sea, the remark is not to be taken seriously. From the start, he saw very clearly that his victory would be political rather than military. This is made clear in the general plan which he drew up in Athens 2 years before the first bomb exploded in Nicosia. 1. The objective: to arouse international public opinion, especially among the allies of Greece, by deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice which will focus attention on Cyprus until our aims are achieved. The British must be continuously harried and beset until they are obliged by international diplomacy exercised through the United Nations to examine the Cyprus problem and settle it in accordance with the desires of the Cypriot people and the whole Greek nation. 2. The procedure: activity will be aimed at causing so much confusion and damage in the ranks of the British forces as to make it manifest abroad that they are no longer in complete control of the situation. The campaign will be carried out on 3 fronts. 1. Sabotage against government installations and military posts. 2. Attacks on British forces by a considerable number of armed fighting groups. And 3. Organization of passive resistance by the population. Because of the difficulties in the way of a large-scale guerrilla struggle, the main weight of the campaign will be placed on sabotage, and therefore the chief task of the fighting groups will be to support and cover the work of saboteurs by upsetting and diverting into government forces. Success will not be achieved by minor and intermittent attacks, but only by a continuous campaign aimed at getting important results. It should not be supposed that by these means we should expect to impose a total material defeat on the British forces. Our purpose is to bring about a moral defeat by keeping up the offensive until the objectives stated in the first paragraph of this plan are realized. By the end of June 1955, the second phase of the campaign had ended. EOKA fighters were informed in a bulletin that the material results had not been up to the expectations of the leader. There had been few casualties, and the damage caused by the sabotage had been relatively insignificant from the economic point of view. Presumably, it was this to which Grievous referred when he spoke of material results. In political terms, however, the EOKA campaign had already achieved a considerable measure of success. The primary purpose of the organization was being realized. The issue of self-determination for Cyprus had been called dramatically to the attention of the world. British public opinion, in particular, had been aroused, and with the anticipated results. The policy of a government that had said it could never consider Cypriot independence, Cyprus supposedly being indispensable to Britain's military security in the Mediterranean, was being questioned, and there were already second thoughts about the word never. 2 years earlier, the British had refused to discuss Cyprus with the Greek government. Now the Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, sent invitations to both Athens and Ankara to attend a tripartite conference in London. Tripartite? Triple party conference in London. Archbishop Makarios, seeking a larger forum and a better solution than could be expected from any such meeting, flew to Athens to press the Greek government to appeal to the United Nations. Before leaving, he sent Grievous his congratulations, adding, quote, "EOKA has contributed infinitely more to the Cyprus struggle than 75 years of paper war. The name of Diogenes is an enigma to the British, and it is a legend as well. Already it has passed into the pages of the liberation movement's history." End quote. Grievous was preparing a general attack timed to coincide with the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in the fall. As an initial step, he proposed to put the native police force out of action as a reliable law enforcement agency, so as to compel the British to extend their military forces, which were being used mainly to guard government buildings or held in their barracks for riot duty and similar emergencies. In an order dated June 28, he informed EOKA group leaders, quote, "The aim of our next offensive will be to terrorize the police and to paralyze the administration, both in the towns and the countryside. If this aim is achieved, the results will be threefold. Disillusionment will spread through the police force so rapidly that most of them, if they do not actually help us, will turn a blind eye to our activities. Active intervention of the army and security, which will stretch the troops and tire them out. The falling morale of the army will also influence its leaders. In the face of our strength and persistence and the trouble they cause, it is very probable that the United Nations, through member countries who take an interest in Cyprus affairs, will seek to bring about a solution. The results we want will be obtained by 1. Murderous attacks against policemen who are out of sympathy with our aims or who try to hunt us down. 2. Ambushes against police patrols in towns or raids on country police stations. 3. Obstructing free movement of the police across the island by laying ambushes against individuals or groups. The police were given notice of what to expect in a leaflet posted on walls in the villages and scattered through the city streets by schoolchildren. To the police, I have warned you, and I shall carry out my warning to the letter. Darker days await the tyrants of Cyprus, heavier punishments the traitors. Do not try to block our path, or you will stain it with your blood. I have given orders that anyone who tries to stop the Cypriot patriots will be executed. Anyone who tries to arrest or to search Cypriot patriots will be shot. You have nothing to fear so long as you do not get in our way. EOKA, the leader, Digenis. See how much more powerful and short that is relative to the quote from the Israeli terrorists was in the previous chapter. If I can find that. Who was that by? Fuck it. Having given the warning, EOKA proceeded with a series of raids on police stations that served a twofold purpose. The attacks frightened the police and also gave the organization a means of getting badly needed arms, since few were arriving from Greece, where the first weapons and supplies had been obtained. The campaign in the towns lagged, a fact Grievous explains almost apologetically was, quote, due to the total inexperience of the execution groups, end quote. Results were nevertheless obtained. Several policemen were killed and others wounded in Nicosia and Famagusta. Scores resigned, and those who remained, says Grievous, scarcely dared show their faces outside of their stations. The effect of the raids was to throw the administration entirely on the defensive. Armed sentries walked around and around the police stations at night. And when the police had to close a station temporarily, they took all of their weapons with them. The British knew next to nothing about EOKA, who its members were, where they might be found. Those who might have been able to tell them, the Greek Cypriot members of the police force, were soon silenced. On August 28th, a constable of the special branch who had been marked for death because of his too zealous applications to duty was posted at a political meeting in Ledra Street in Nicosia. He was shot down before a crowd of hundreds by a young government clerk, Michael Karolis, K-A-R-A-O-L-I-S, a member of a three-man EOKA execution squad. The killing in broad daylight before hundreds of people in the heart of the capital was a fatal blow to police morale. The killer, Karolis, was later caught and sentenced to death, but his work had been done. The slaying of the special branchman, says Grievous, shattered opposition to EOKA among the Greek police. Increasingly, Turks were recruited to replace Greeks on the police force, intensifying the hostility between the two ethnic communities. Of the Greeks who remained on the British payroll, many became spies for EOKA, accurately informing the organization of British intentions from day to day. Those who were not so employed closed their eyes to EOKA activities as Grievous had predicted, and ceased to be of effective service to the British or a hindrance to the liberation movement. British propaganda was bitter in its denunciation of the methods used by EOKA, but Grievous was not concerned, as he later wrote, quote, all war is cruel, and the only way to win against superior force is by ruse and trickery. You can no more afford to make a difference between striking in front or striking from behind than you can between employing rifles and howitzers. The British may criticize me as much as they like for making war on Cyprus, but I was not obliged to ask their permission to do so, nor can they now deny that I made it in the most successful way. End quote. Terrorism was supported by intensive political agitation that brought out huge crowds in the principal towns. During one demonstration in Nicosia in September, army trucks were overturned and set afire, and the British Institute was burned to the ground. The headlines generated by this activity failed to win Greece a hearing on the Cyprus question in the United Nations. The Greek appeal was rejected on September 23rd, but the EOKA campaign had shaken the British. 2 days after the UN rejection, it was announced in London that a new governor would replace Sir Robert Armitage immediately. The replacement was the much-decorated Field Marshal Sir John Harding. an outstanding British general of World War II who had just relinquished the post of Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He was, in fact, writes Grievous, the leading British soldier of his day, and no higher compliment could have been paid to us than to send against our tiny forces a man with so great a reputation and so brilliant a career. Harding, as it developed, was to have no better success against EOKA than had his predecessor. The appointment of a military man to replace the civilian governor made it clear that Downing Street intended to stamp out EOKA by main force, rather than to continue a police action. The trouble, as is usually the case when opposing guerrillas, and even more so when fighting terrorists, was that there was nothing substantial against which to apply the force. As Grievous explains, quote, "The British answer to our methods was to flood the island with troops. It was the wrong answer. Numbers have little meaning in guerrilla warfare. From the guerrillas' point of view, it is positively dangerous to increase the size of groups beyond a certain point. I call this the saturation point. It is determined by the nature of the terrain, the skill of the fighters, their requirements in food and supplies, the tactics employed, and the need to keep down casualties. Any given area can usefully absorb a certain number of men. In mountainous country, where peaks and ravines are dead ground, the figure is only a fraction of the numbers required elsewhere. I myself, when I joined the Andartes, Andartes, in the mountains, always felt uneasy if there were more than half a dozen of us together. Even in the plains, the saturation point is lower than one might suppose. For example, to use more than 5 or 6 men in a village attack would serve no purpose, for the more numerous the attackers, the more difficult it is for them to escape after the action. On the same principle, villages where we were strong pretended inertia on my orders until it was appropriate for them to strike. While others, where our forces were weaker, continued to attack repeatedly, simply to deceive the enemy. If this led to arrests, even of a whole group, it was not important, for there was always a complete reserve group waiting to fill their places. Thus I never disclosed my full strength to the enemy, but after each sudden eruption of violence left an empty battlefield. When the British tried to strike back, they found nothing to strike at. This was the secret of my success throughout 4 years of hard fighting, and my principles did not change when Harding came on the scene. Footnote, The Memoirs of General Grievous. That might be something to check out right there. Take a swig. It is well to remember that Grievous is talking about a campaign based primarily on terrorism and sabotage, fought on a small island affording little space for maneuver, and aimed at political rather than military effect. He was not trying to build self-sustaining guerrilla base areas or to reach the ultimate guerrilla goal, impossible in Cyprus, of an equalization of military forces. In terms of Cyprus, small guerrilla units could be treated as expendable. They were expendable in precisely the way that terrorists are expendable, who do not seek to build a military force, but rather to produce political and psychological effects, often by sacrificing themselves. Grievous cleverly used his urban and rural groups in interaction. When he wished to conduct a campaign in the countryside, he raised big political demonstrations in the towns that kept the troops occupied there on riot duty, while his guerrilla groups made lightning attacks on rural objectives. When he was planning a new drive in the cities, he created diversions in the countryside that brought the troops out in intensive radissages. Quote, "My resources were meager, and I could not hope to win a military victory," he writes. "It was rather a question of raising a force and keeping it in being no matter what the enemy did to destroy it. This and more was achieved in the first 6 months." End quote. On his arrival in Nicosia, Harding made a cursory attempt to negotiate with Archbishop Macarios. When the negotiations broke down within a few days, Grievous ordered a full-scale EOKA offensive. New attacks were launched against village police stations in an effort to draw out the army. EOKA men raided the Mitsuro mine and escaped with 1,500 sticks of dynamite, 600 detonators, and 3,000 yards of fuse. Another raiding party invaded the military warehouses in Famagusta harbor, bound and gagged a watchman, and drove off with a truckload of British arms. Bren guns, Stens, mortars, and bazookas. Political agitation was intensified, and the British worsened the situation for themselves by ill-advised attempts to prevent public demonstrations. The timing of the announcement that Mikhail Carolus, the first hero of the revolution, quote-unquote, had been sentenced to death could not have been worse. The announcement came on October 28th, a national holiday marking the refusal of Greece to surrender to the Axis powers in 1940. Harding banned any sort of public demonstration. Grievous responded by calling on Cypriots to defy the ban, and a series of bloody clashes resulted. Troops opened fire on a righteous crowd. Troops opened fire on a riotous crowd, wounding 3 men, and there were more than 1,000 arrests, jamming the jails of the principal towns as the result of street fighting. When British forces occupied in the towns by demonstrations and sabotage, Grievous ordered an island-wide assault. It began on November 18th, when more than 50 bombs were thrown in 30 separate attacks throughout Cyprus. By the end of a week, several hundred attacks had been carried out. The main post office in Nicosia was bombed. The bomb simply dropped in the letterbox, and half the building was destroyed. An 8-pound bomb carried into the KKO military encampment outside of Nicosia in the saddlebag of a bicycle blew the roof off of the warrant officers' and sergeants' mess and killed 2 sergeants. Army posts at Limassol and Larnaca were attacked. Guerrillas in the Kyrenia range attacked 2 mines and engaged in firefights with the troops detailed to guard them. Mine company trucks carrying dynamite were ambushed, and near Famagusta 3 military vehicles were blasted off the road, causing the army to stop all military movements on the roads at night. Grievous himself led an ambush attack on 2 army trucks, destroyed one, and then withdrew with his squad to a nearby hilltop, and calmly watched as a relief party, which did not appear until 3 hours after the attack, removed the body of a dead soldier from the wreckage. No attempt was made to search the area. A state of emergency was declared throughout the island on November 26th. Police were given extraordinary powers of search and arrest. Strikes were forbidden. The death penalty was imposed for carrying arms, and saboteurs were liable to life imprisonment. British troops, responding to the assassination of their comrades in arms, much as the Black and Tans had done in Ireland, vented their feelings on the civilian population. Soldiers stopped farm trucks on their way to the market and dumped their loads of fruit and vegetables out on the road. Search parties invaded private homes, abused the occupants, and destroyed their possessions. Suspects were arrested without warrant and held for weeks or months in detention camps without trial. The security forces set about their work, comments Grievous, in a manner which might have been deliberately designed to drive the population into our arms. It had that effect. Grievous had gone into the Trudeau's mountains to coordinate guerrilla operations, and on several occasions he narrowly escaped British commandos combing the area where he happened to be hiding. On one occasion, 2 British forces totaling 700 men, lost in the midst on a mountainside, closed in on each other as the guerrillas escaped, and engaged in a battle with each other that lasted for an hour before they discovered that they were firing on their own troops. There were more than 50 casualties. On New Year's Day of 1956, Harding broadcast the prediction that the days of EOKA are numbered. The following day, 800 British troops closed in on a woods where Grievous was thought to be, spent the entire day combing an area 2 miles square, and withdrew with 3 prisoners. Grievous reports I was, in fact, a few miles south of the operations area, watching the progress of the search through binoculars. I was astonished at the unmethodical way the troops went about their work." End quote. On the 22nd of the month, EOKA units simultaneously raided every village on Cyprus, in an effort to gather up all of the several thousand shotguns on the island that were registered with the police. 1 EOKA man was wounded and a soldier was killed in the raids. More than 800 shotguns were seized, and Grievous proceeded to organize special shotgun units. Quote, "These were used to harry the British by night, attack army camps, create diversions for major guerrilla attacks, and execute traitors." End quote. By February of 1956, the strength of the army had been increased from 4,000 to some 22,000 men. EOKA by this time had a total frontline strength of 273 men, supported by some 750 part-time guerrillas in the villages, armed only with shotguns. The frontline fighters included 80 men divided into 15 groups in Nicosia, 76 men in Famagusta, and 34 men in Limassol, the three principal towns of the island. The numerical odds were vastly in favor of the British, but Grievous considered the army, supported by 5,000 police, a cumbersome body that provided a wealth of targets, new and old, in both town and mountain. So it proved. Grievous intensified his campaign of terror and sabotage. The homes of British senior officers were bombed, British servicemen were shot down in the streets, bombs were tossed into clubs and taverns frequented by troops. A servant who belonged to EOKA even succeeded in planting a bomb under the mattress of Sir John Harding's bed. Fortunately for the governor, a sudden change in the temperature, so Grievous explains, affected the time pencil, and the bomb did not explode until after it had been discovered and removed. The British seem to have learned little or nothing from their previous experience of terrorism elsewhere. Efforts to intimidate the civilian population that aided EOKA only embittered it. The experiment of imposing collective fines on the Greek community in reprisal against attacks on British forces, the levies ranged from a few £100s in some small villages to €40,000 in Famagusta and €35,000 in Limassol, was abandoned after 6 months as ineffective. Stern measures against captured EOKA fighters not only failed to act as a deterrent, but created severe political repercussions. When the first of the EOKA gunmen to be executed were hanged for murder in Central Prison, Nicosia, on May 10, 1956, huge demonstrations in Greece were called in protest. 7 persons were killed in a riot in Athens, and the mayor of that city solemnly hammered to pieces a marble plaque dedicated to Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip before the eyes of a cheering crowd. Even the British press condemned the hangings. No doubt sympathy was felt for the 2 British hostages whom Grievous had executed by EOKA the next day in reprisal for the executions. But the headlines had already been spent on what millions evidently considered a miscarriage of British justice. It is an irony of political warfare and a political fact to be considered and understood, that the rules are not the same for both sides. British troops fared no better against the EOKA guerrillas in the countryside than against the terrorists in the towns. The troops burned thousands of acres of timber in scattered efforts to flush out guerrilla bands on the mountainsides, but few guerrillas were caught, and those were quickly replaced by others. Quote, Harding tried to strike back at the mountain groups, writes Grievous, but lacking any comprehensive plan and failing to grasp our methods, he had few successes. His activities were dependent on spasmodic tips from informers, which were often inexact and unreliable, and led him to concentrate on narrow zones. As many as 50 truckloads of troops would be poured into one small area, which would be searched for a day, but nearly always we slipped away before the search began and watched its progress from the neighboring heights, certain that they would not extend the operation beyond its original limits. End quote. What should have been done? Examining his opponent's problem in retrospect, Grievous says, quote, Harding persisted in his error. He underrated his enemy on the one hand and overweighted his forces on the other. But one does not use a tank to catch a field mice. A cat will do the job better. The field marshal's only hope of finding us was to play cat and mouse, to use tiny, expertly trained groups who could work with cunning and patience and strike rapidly when we least expected. End quote. No such groups were ever developed, and the war continued along the lines and with the results that might have been expected. What Harding was unable to accomplish with 20,000 troops in 1956 could not be accomplished by his successor with twice that many in 1958. 43,000 British soldiers were on Cyprus when the shooting ended, but what they were doing there, few could have said. Certainly, they were not keeping the peace. Grievous offers his record of EOKA activities for October 2, 1958, as giving an idea of the scale of operations at the time. Quote, Larnaca, soldier killed by bomb, civilian agent dead by execution squad. Nicosia, bomb thrown into police headquarters from car, casualties unknown. Famagusta, 2 army trucks ambushed, casualties unknown. Limassol, 8 Britons injured by bomb at Acropole Hotel, 4 soldiers injured by bomb thrown at truck. Platani, 2 soldiers killed, 2 wounded in mined truck. Panaya Stavros, Stavros, 2 soldiers killed, 2 wounded in ambush. Pyroi, Truck ambushed. Casualties unknown. Mesoyi. Mesoyi. 2 soldiers killed in ambush of truck. Piyi. Piyi. 2 soldiers killed, 2 wounded in mined truck. Peristirona. Pretty much how it sounds. Peristirona. Bombs thrown at 2 army trucks. Casualties unknown. End quote. The British authorities embittered the struggle, but did little to change its course by involving the Turkish community in the fighting. The recruitment of Turks into the police and the incitement of lateral racial antagonisms produced some bloody civilian massacres and a tragic toll of innocent lives on both sides. But divide and rule as an instrument of British policy failed in Cyprus. The eventual political settlement that was reached in the Zurich and London agreements established the Republic of Cyprus under a constitution written by London, Athens, and Ankara, was less than satisfactory to Grievous. He had fought for the independence of the island as a step toward union with Greece, enosis, and this was denied. But the British could scarcely claim to have won even a partial victory. They had paid a heavy price in money, lives, and prestige during 4 years of futile fighting and had nothing to show for it but a paper compromise that was worse than outright defeat. Where there had been a troublesome colonial question, an explosive international issue was created, and one that remains to date a grave threat to peace in the Mediterranean, a threat not least of all to the British themselves. As to the conflict that led to Zurich, it was round by round a series of clear defeats for colonial arms and colonial policies. The British proceeded against EOKA as against a band of ordinary criminals, relying on the methods that would be used to put down an outbreak of banditry, and seeming never to realize what had been perfectly clear to Grievous from the start. Quote, I laughed aloud when I read that General A or Brigadier B had come to Cyprus to put into operation the methods that had won him fame elsewhere. They could not understand that the Cyprus struggle was unique in motive, psychology, and circumstance, and involved not a handful of insurrectionists, but the whole people. End quote. That concludes Chapter 8, War of the Flea.